Poor girl sells music box to billionaire. He opens it and breaks down in tears seeing the photo. Before watching the video, please leave a like and subscribe to support the channel. Snow drifted softly past the cracked window pane as the morning light crept into the cramped, aging apartment. In the silence, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic and the occasional groan of old pipes, a small figure stirred beneath a frayed blanket. 5-year-old Lila Moore blinked her sleepy eyes open, the cold air stinging her nose, and sat up slowly. There were no soft lullabies or warm voices to greet her, only stillness. And that stillness meant one thing. Her mother had had another bad night. She pushed the covers aside and slid her tiny feet onto the cold, peeling linoleum floor. The old space heater in the corner had stopped working again sometime in the night. Carefully, Lila tiptoed across the small studio, moving like a shadow through the dim morning. She didn't make a sound. She'd learned how not to. In a home like theirs, quiet was a form of love. She peeked into the adjoining bedroom where her mother, Clara, lay curled on a narrow bed, her face pale against the yellowed pillowcase. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Lila hesitated, heart fluttering like a frightened bird. "Mama," she whispered, barely audible. Clara's eyes opened slowly as if each blink cost her energy she no longer had. "Good morning, sunshine," she rasped, managing a faint smile. Lila nodded, swallowing hard. "Did you sleep?" Clara's answer was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "A little." They both knew it wasn't true. The coughing had gone on for hours the night before, echoing off the thin walls like the sound of something breaking slowly. Something sacred. Something final. Lila climbed gently onto the bed and nestled beside her, wrapping her arms around her mother's thin frame. She tried not to show how scared she was, but her little heart carried burdens far too heavy for her tiny body. Burdens no child should have to bear. In her short life, she had become many things. Caretaker, nurse, cook, comforter. Words like play and toy had long since vanished from her world. "I'll get your medicine," she said quietly, brushing a damp strand of hair from her mother's face. "You don't have to, sweetheart," Clara whispered, reaching weakly for her. "Stay here a little longer." But Lila was already climbing down. There was no time for resting, not when every minute was borrowed from a clock that seemed to tick louder with each passing day. In the kitchenette, she filled a cracked glass with lukewarm tap water, carefully counting the pills in the palm of her hand. White ones for the pain, pink ones for the nausea, blue ones that didn't seem to do anything at all anymore. She remembered each one, remembered the days they first appeared in the bathroom cabinet, multiplying like bad dreams. As she prepared a small bowl of oatmeal, she glanced at the object sitting on the high shelf above the couch, the only beautiful thing they owned. A wooden music box, hand-carved and faded with time, trimmed in delicate gold filigree. When opened, a tiny ballerina twirled in slow, graceful circles to the sound of a gentle lullaby. The melody always made her chest ache in ways she didn't fully understand. Her mother used to say it came from someone special. A man she loved a long time ago, before the sickness, before the nights filled with coughing and fear. "He gave it to me the last time I saw him," Clara once said, her voice tinged with something between sorrow and longing. "He never knew about you, Lila. I never had the chance to tell him." Lila never asked for more. Some truths, even at 5 years old, felt too delicate to question. But she would often watch the ballerina dance and wonder who the man was, the one who left a gift so lovely, then disappeared like mist in morning sun. That morning, as Clara slowly sipped the water and took her pills with trembling hands, Lila returned to the couch and stared again at the music box. She thought about the envelope of money hidden in the drawer, enough for maybe 3 more days of medicine, maybe less. Their landlord had knocked last week. The fridge held only a carton of eggs and a half-empty jug of milk. The fear she tried to keep buried kept clawing its way to the surface. She turned to her mother, who was now dozing, the weight of exhaustion pulling her under again. Her breathing was shallow, her skin too pale. Lila's eyes filled with tears, but she wiped them away quickly. Crying didn't solve anything. She needed to be strong. She made a decision. With careful hands, she reached up and took the music box down from the shelf. She wrapped it in the only nice scarf they had, a soft, faded pink one her mother used to wear on special days. Then she placed the wrapped bundle in her small backpack, pulled on her coat, and quietly opened the apartment door. The hallway outside smelled of dust and old cigarettes. Her footsteps echoed on the cracked tiles as she walked out into the winter morning. The wind stung her cheeks, but she didn't stop. She knew where to go. She remembered a shop, an old one with strange treasures and polished wood counters. Her mother had once taken her there years ago when things weren't so bad. She didn't know what the music box was worth. All she knew was that it was the most precious thing they had, and it had to be enough. It had to be. As she stepped onto the crowded sidewalk, the city towering above her like a world too big and too cold for someone so small, Lila straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath. She would find a way. She had to, because her mother's life depended on it. And somewhere in her young heart, she believed, hoped, that maybe, just maybe, the world still had a bit of kindness left for a little girl, carrying the weight of the world in her backpack. The wind scraped through the alleyways like a whisper of sorrow as Lila Moore, only 5 years old and already far too acquainted with heartbreak, stood at the edge of the sidewalk with her small backpack clutched tightly to her chest. Inside it, wrapped in the soft, pink scarf her mother once wore on sunny days, lay the last piece of beauty their life still held, a music box, old and delicate, with a ballerina who danced each time its lid was opened. It had sat on the high shelf in their apartment like a quiet guardian, a fragile memory of a man her mother never named but always seemed to grieve. And now, as the cold air bit at her cheeks and the city loomed ahead like a steel jungle of strangers, Lila prepared to part with it. Not for toys or clothes, not for food even, but for something far more precious. A little more time with her mother. Clara's illness had grown worse in recent weeks. The coughs came harder now, deeper, tearing through her like a storm against glass. She'd stopped trying to hide the blood in the tissues, and even her reassurances had grown quiet, like faded echoes of a once strong lullaby. The medicine was almost gone. Rent was overdue. The fridge had emptied itself into silence. And still somehow, Clara had found the strength to kiss Lila's forehead each morning, to tell her she was her sunshine, her miracle, her reason for breathing. That morning, Clara had tried to stand, tried and failed. She had collapsed against the counter, her face ashen, her breath ragged. And Lila, frozen in place, had felt something primal and fierce awaken in her chest. The world, it seemed, was determined to take everything. But she would not let it take her mother. Not yet. She'd made the decision without telling anyone. Not that there was anyone to tell. There were no grandparents, no neighbors who cared, no teachers who asked more than they had to. Just her and her mama against the world. And now it was Lila's turn to fight. Her tiny boots scraped the icy pavement as she made her way down streets that loomed high and unfamiliar. The people rushed past her like ghosts, tall, busy, blind to the little girl weaving her way through the crowd with the weight of the world zipped inside a backpack meant for crayons and coloring books. Her breath came in fast puffs, her eyes fixed ahead. She had only been to the store once, years ago, when her mother still had strength in her limbs and dreams in her voice. It had smelled like old wood and something mysterious, like dust and stories. Her mother had paused in front of its window once and said, "This place, it holds secrets. The kind that time forgets, but hearts remember." Lila hadn't understood then. She wasn't sure she did now, but she remembered. When she reached the street, it looked smaller than she recalled. The paint on the sign had peeled more. The awning sagged. Still, the gold letters above the door spelled it out. Antiques and curiosities. And Lila, without pause, pushed through the heavy door as the bell overhead chimed. Not like a welcome, but like a warning. The man behind the counter looked up, startled. He was old, with silver hair and spectacles that sat low on his nose. His hands, wrinkled and steady, rested atop a ledger as he squinted at her. "Yes," he said, his voice roughened by years. "Can I help you?" Lila's fingers trembled as she unzipped her backpack and carefully unwrapped the scarf. The music box caught the light from the overhead bulbs, and for a moment, it seemed to shimmer like something magical. Something too beautiful for the world she was about to release it into. "I want to sell this," she said, her voice small but unshaking. The man leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "That's quite an item," he muttered. "But I don't buy from children. Where are your parents?" "My mama's sick." she said, standing straighter. We need money for her medicine. There was a silence then, the kind that thickens the air like fog, pressing in on every surface. The man's lips parted, but no words came. He looked at her again, not just as a child, but as something else. A soldier of love, a warrior in pigtails. I can give you maybe $70, he said slowly. It's a nice piece, but I don't think... She said it was from someone she loved, Lila interrupted. Before I was born. He never knew about me. She said it's the only thing left of him. She said the words like a script she had rehearsed in her heart, and they cut through the air like a blade. The doorbell chimed again. This time it was a man in a long black coat, tall, sleek, and commanding without trying to be. Graham Whitaker was not someone who wandered into shops like these. He had assistants for that, people who sourced rare artifacts and vintage oddities for his sprawling properties. But something that morning had drawn him here, a sense he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the glimmer of gold on the windowsill, or maybe it was the exhaustion that gnawed at him after another restless night in his million-dollar penthouse. Either way, he stepped in just in time to hear Lila's voice and to see the music box catch the light like it had been waiting just for him. He didn't say a word at first. He walked past the shelves of porcelain figurines and ancient maps, stopping only when he stood beside the little girl and looked down at the music box resting on the counter. Is that for sale? He asked, more to the air than anyone in particular. Lila looked up. Her eyes met his, and something unspoken passed between them, something neither of them would understand until much later. Yes, she said softly. Graham leaned down, eyeing the box with a strange pull in his chest. It felt familiar. He reached out and opened the lid. The music began, slow, haunting, soft. The ballerina twirled. The air seemed to change. He didn't blink. How much do you want for it? He asked, still staring at the spinning dancer. $300, Lila said without hesitation. The shopkeeper coughed, startled. Child, you don't understand how these things work. 500, Graham said quietly, cutting him off. The room froze. Lila blinked. But, the old man began. I said 500, Graham repeated, pulling his wallet from his coat and counting out the bills. And I want to know its story. Lila stared at the money. She had never seen so much in her life. Her voice, though barely above a whisper, didn't waver. It was my mom's. A man gave it to her a long time ago. She said it's all she has left of him. And he doesn't know I exist. Graham's hand stilled. Something inside him cracked. A hairline fracture in a wall that had stood for decades. What's your mother's name? He asked. Clara Moore. The name meant nothing, but her face, her eyes, that music, the ache in his chest, all of it clawed at his memory like a ghost in the dark. He handed her the money gently. Thank you, he said. I'll take good care of it. Lila nodded, her eyes lingering on the music box one last time before tucking the bills into her backpack. Please do, she whispered. Then, as quietly as she had arrived, she turned and walked out the door, back into the cold, back to her mother, not knowing that her small act of love had just set something in motion that would change everything. Back inside, Graham stood there alone, the music box still playing. The ballerina spun, and somewhere beneath his ribs, something ancient began to stir. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that inside the base of the music box, tucked beneath a secret compartment he had yet to discover, was a photograph. A faded image of a young woman with dark hair and a radiant smile, standing beside a man who looked just like him, but younger. A photo that would shatter everything he believed about his past, about his family, about who he truly was. This wasn't just a purchase. This wasn't just a trinket sold by a desperate little girl. This was destiny reaching back through time. And Graham Whitaker had just bought the key to his own history and the missing pieces of a family he never knew existed. But he wouldn't understand that until he opened the base, until he saw the photo, until the truth, wrapped in time and music, came spilling out. You, dear listener, may think you know where this story is going, but I promise you, you don't. Stay with me, because the music box wasn't just a gift. It was a door. And Lila, the little girl with a heart too big for her tiny frame, had just opened it. Not for herself, not even for her mother. But for a man who thought he had everything, until he realized he had nothing at all. The bell above the antique store door jingled softly, its chime barely louder than the whisper of wind that trailed in from the cold street. Graham Whitaker stepped inside, his polished shoes silent on the old wooden floor. He had not intended to enter this place. In truth, he had walked past it a dozen times over the years, without ever glancing twice. Stores like this, filled with forgotten things and dusty memories, didn't fit into the world of men like Graham. His was a world of skyscrapers and shareholders, of private jets and luxury retreats, where time was currency and silence was bought with high-rise glass and double doors. But that day, something tugged at him. He had been walking, a rare thing for him, because he couldn't bear to sit one more minute in the sleek loneliness of his penthouse. It was too quiet, too clean, too hollow. He had everything, and yet nothing felt like it meant anything anymore. As he entered the shop, warmth wrapped around him like a faded quilt. It smelled of polished oak and aged leather, of old books and old lives. His eyes were adjusting to the dim light when he saw her. A little girl, no older than 5 or 6, standing at the counter with a soft, pink scarf in her hands. Her coat was too thin for the weather. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. Her hands shook slightly as she gently unwrapped something precious and placed it on the counter like an offering. A small, intricately carved music box. Even from a distance, it caught his eye. Something about it, the way the gold detailing curled along the edges, the way the ballerina's skirt seemed frozen mid-spin, called to him like a half-remembered lullaby. He took a step closer, then another, unable to look away. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with worn spectacles, peered at the girl with concern. "I told you, sweetheart," he was saying kindly but firmly. "I don't buy from children. Where are your parents?" "My mama's sick," the girl said, standing a little taller. "We need money for her medicine." Graham stopped walking. The words, simple as they were, cut through him like glass. He watched her, this small, trembling figure, wrapped in responsibility no child should ever carry. She looked up at the man with eyes far older than her years. There was no plea in her voice, just quiet desperation, the kind that didn't cry, but ached. "I'll take it," Graham heard himself say. The words left his mouth before he had even thought them through. The shopkeeper turned, startled. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, clearly recognizing him. "I didn't realize—" "How much?" Graham asked, ignoring the man. His gaze was locked on the girl. She looked at him, her eyes filled with surprise and something else. Hope, maybe, but cautious, like a flickering candle in the wind. $300, she said softly. "That's what the medicine costs." The shopkeeper sputtered. "It's not worth—" "500, Graham interrupted, already reaching into the inside pocket of his tailored coat. He pulled out a wallet and began counting bills with a practiced hand. "On one condition," he added, glancing at the girl. "You tell me where this came from." The girl hesitated, her small fingers pressing into the counter. "It was my mama's. A man gave it to her before I was born. She said it's the only thing she has left of him." The words stirred something in Graham's chest, a slow and terrible awakening. "And the man?" "She said he never knew she was going to have a baby," she replied. "He just went away." Graham paused, the money still in his hand. He looked down at the box again. There was something about it, a strange, aching familiarity. Not just the craftsmanship, but the melody it played, the kind of wood used in its design, even the faded, careful etchings on the underside. It was as though his past had reached out and placed this object in his path, daring him to remember. He placed the money in her hands. "I'll take care of it," he promised. "Thank you, mister," she said, carefully folding the bills into her coat pocket. She glanced at the music box one last time. "Please don't break it." And with that, she turned and walked out into the street, disappearing into the city's gray sprawl like a petal in the wind. Graham stood there for a long time, staring at the music box. "Wrap it up," he told the shopkeeper. He didn't wait for it to be bagged. He simply carried it out in his arms, the same way a man might carry something sacred. His driver was waiting just outside, leaning against the black car that gleamed like oil under the overcast sky. "Home, sir?" he asked, opening the door. "No," Graham said after a beat. "The lake house." The driver blinked but said nothing. The lake house hadn't been used in years, not since before his mother passed away, not since the memories of summers and childhood and fireflies had grown too painful to face. The drive was long and silent. Snow began to fall again, soft and slow, frosting the world in white. Graham sat in the back, the music box on his lap, unopened. He couldn't bring himself to lift the lid just yet. He was afraid of what it might awaken. When they reached the lake house, it looked exactly as he remembered. Old stone walls, tall windows, the dock stretching into the still water like a quiet secret. Inside, the furniture was covered with sheets. The air smelled of time and dust. He stepped into his mother's old sitting room, where the grand piano still stood in the corner, untouched for over a decade. He sat on the window bench and, with a breath he didn't know he was holding, opened the music box. The melody spilled out like a song, soft, melancholic, unbearably familiar. His hand shook. He turned the box over, tracing the edge of its base, and then he felt it. A ridge, a panel not quite flush with the rest. He pressed gently. A soft click. The bottom opened. Inside was a photograph, folded delicately, as though someone had placed it there for safekeeping. He pulled it out and stared, and the world tilted. It was a picture of two people, a woman with long dark hair and luminous eyes, and a man, a young man, with a crooked smile and eyes just like his father. Graham nearly dropped it. He recognized the woman. Not her name, that had been lost to time, but her face. She had worked at the family vineyard one summer decades ago. He remembered seeing her once, laughing by the water, twirling barefoot with flowers in her hair. His father had smiled at her that way. Not even his mother had ever drawn that look from him. And then he remembered the sudden way she had disappeared. No goodbye, no explanation. Just gone. Graham's chest tightened. The girl, the music box, the missing man. He stood up abruptly, heart pounding. His breath came in shallow bursts. Could it be? Could this little girl, this fragile, trembling child, be his half-sister? He needed answers. Immediately. He grabbed the photo, the box, and stormed out of the house. Back in the car, he told the driver to head to his father's estate. Now, he added, voice like thunder. When he arrived, he didn't wait for formalities. He barged into his father's study, where the old man sat reading by the fire, glass of brandy in hand. Who is she? Graham demanded, thrusting the photo forward. His father looked up, and the color drained from his face. Where did you get that? He whispered, his voice barely audible. Answer me. His father took the photo in trembling hands. His silence spoke volumes. I loved her, he said at last, more than anything. But I couldn't be with her. My father threatened everything. Her safety, her family's livelihood. I thought I was protecting her. Did you know she was pregnant? Graham asked, voice cracking. His father looked up, and in that moment, something in the old man shattered. No, he said. No, I never knew. Graham sank into a chair, the photo in his hands. There's a girl, he whispered. A child. She's living in poverty. Her mother is sick, and she sold this music box to pay for medicine. His father covered his face with his hands. I might have a sister, Graham said, a tear sliding down his cheek. Not from sadness, but from something deeper. Regret. Grief, hope. She might be dying, he added, barely able to speak. And she doesn't even know who she really is. Silence fell over the room. The fire crackled. The music box sat between them, spinning its soft song into the air, like a memory refusing to die. We need to find them, his father said finally, his voice breaking. We need to find her. And just like that, everything shifted. Graham Whitaker, a man who had spent his life building walls, of wealth, of silence, of solitude, now found himself standing at the edge of something far more important than any business deal he had ever closed. The beginning of a family he never knew he had, the start of a second chance. And as he looked once more at the photo, at the woman who might have changed everything if only time had been kinder, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't felt in years. A purpose, a heartbeat, a reason to hope. The ride home was silent. Graham Whitaker, usually a man of purpose and poise, sat slouched in the back of his luxury car, his fingers gently wrapped around a worn music box wrapped in a scarf that smelled faintly of jasmine and old dust. The city lights passed like ghosts beyond the tinted windows, but he barely noticed them. All he could see, again and again, was the image of that little girl, cold, quiet, but full of fire, handing him the last precious thing her family owned. Not with a smile, not with charm or persuasion, but with simple, pure urgency. She hadn't begged, she hadn't pleaded, she had just looked up and told the truth. My mama's sick. We need money for her medicine. And she had said it like someone who had learned far too early that the world doesn't wait for you to be ready. That truth, the hard kind, had hit Graham in a place he hadn't felt in years. Not in the polished shell of who he had become, but in the part of him he had almost forgotten. The son, the boy, the one who once believed in love before it all turned into contracts and contingencies. Back at the Pennant House, the elevator opened silently into a space that felt colder than usual. The walls of glass and stone, the perfectly arranged furniture, the million-dollar art. It all felt sterile now, like a hotel room made to impress but never to hold love. He walked into his study, removed his coat, and sat heavily at the desk, placing the music box before him with care. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he just stared at it. The swirls in the wood, the delicate gold inlay, the smoothness of the ballerina's outstretched arms. The longer he looked, the more uneasy he felt. Why did it feel like this object already knew him? With a breath that trembled ever so slightly, he opened the lid. The melody began immediately, slow, haunting, impossibly familiar. A gentle lullaby that rose like mist in the room, wrapping around him in waves. The ballerina turned, graceful and sad, spinning to a tune that felt like it had been plucked from the walls of his childhood. He leaned in. Something about the melody wasn't just beautiful, it was personal. His mother used to hum something like it. No, not his mother. He remembered now. A summer by the lake. He was barely 10, staying with his grandfather at their country estate. There had been a young woman, laughter by the water, fireflies in her hair. She'd come around when his father was visiting. His father had looked at her differently, smiled more, laughed more. She'd left suddenly. No explanation, and then his father stopped going to the lake house. The piano had gone quiet. Graham's breath caught. He turned the music box over and ran his fingers along the bass. There, a seam, a tiny groove almost invisible. He pressed it, and a soft click echoed into the silence. The false bottom shifted, a hidden compartment opened. Inside was a carefully folded photograph. His hand shook as he lifted it. It was old, the colors faded. A young woman, beautiful, bright-eyed, full of joy, stood by a shimmering lake, wrapped in the arms of a man who looked just like Graham. Only younger. So much younger. His father. Graham's heart stuttered. There was no mistaking but that strong jawline, those intense eyes, that easy smile Graham had never seen on his father's face before. Not in boardrooms, not in family portraits, not even with Graham's mother. But here in this photograph, his father looked happy. He had never seen that look, not once, and now, staring at this picture, he felt as though he was meeting a stranger. The woman's name, her name. He racked his memory. It had been whispered once or twice, not by his father, but in passing. Catherine, someone had said. A brief love. A mistake, they'd called her. Graham had been too young to understand. Now he understood everything. The music box wasn't just a keepsake, it was a message. A relic of a love his father had buried. A love that had once meant everything and been lost. And the little girl in the shop, the one with the brave face and shaking hands, the one who sold him this treasure, she wasn't just a stranger. She might be his sister's daughter, his niece. His stomach twisted. A wave of disbelief, horror, guilt. His chest tightened. Could it really be true? Had his father loved someone so deeply, then left her? And if Catherine was the woman in the photo, and if she had a daughter, and if that daughter now had a daughter, it meant Graham had family out there, real family, and they were suffering, living in poverty, while he sat in this penthouse with wine that cost more than their month's rent, while a 5-year-old had to sell a piece of her mother's heart just to buy pills to keep her alive. He felt sick. He needed answers. He reached for his phone and dialed his father's private line. It rang twice. "Graham," his father answered, calm as always. "Is everything all right?" "Do you know someone named Catherine?" Graham asked, skipping all formalities. There was silence on the other end, a long, heavy silence. "Where did you hear that name?" his father finally asked. "You loved her once," Graham said. "Didn't you?" More silence, then, "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" His father sighed, older than he had ever sounded. "Because I couldn't. Because it still hurts. Because I walked away from her when I should have fought for her." "She had a daughter," Graham said. "And that daughter, she has a child now, a little girl. I met her today. She sold me a music box you gave Catherine. It had your picture in it." The phone nearly dropped. His father's voice cracked for the first time in decades. I didn't know." "I think I have a sister, Dad," Graham whispered. "I think we have family we never knew." His father choked back something, a sound like grief trying to find its way out. "Then we have to find them," he said. "We have to." Graham stared at the music box again. "Friends, listeners, if you've made it this far into the story, I want to ask you something from the heart. If this moment touched you, if you felt the twist in Grandma's chest, the heartbreak of realizing that someone you might love is suffering without knowing you exist, please leave a like. Drop a comment for Graham. Let him know he isn't alone as he begins this journey. Share this story with someone who believes in second chances, in lost family, in the quiet power of one small act changing everything. Because right now, Graham is about to do something he's never done before. He's about to walk away from the boardroom, from the suits, from the comfort of denial. He's about to step into a world of unknowns, to find a girl who has no idea that she belongs to a family that could change her life. Not just with money, but with love, with belonging, with truth. And it all started with a ballerina dancing to a forgotten tune in a box full of secrets. Don't miss what comes next, because the journey is only beginning. And for the first time in his life, Graham isn't chasing success. He's chasing connection. He's chasing redemption. He's chasing family. The sun was beginning to set by the time Graham Whitaker stood in front of the towering gates of his father's estate, the old music box cradled in one arm and the faded photograph tucked safely into his coat pocket. The gates opened slowly, their mechanical groan mirroring the turmoil building inside him. It had been years since he'd come here unannounced. Years since he had dared to show up not for business or obligation or some curated family dinner, but for something real, something personal. As the car rolled up the long driveway lined with old oaks and brittle winter grass, Graham could see the familiar mansion looming ahead. Elegant, cold, too perfect, just like his father. He stepped out and walked to the door himself. No assistant, no chauffeur, just a man with a question and a heart full of doubt. The butler opened the door, surprised to see him, and Graham offered no pleasantries. "Where is he?" "Sir, your father is in the study." Without waiting, Graham walked through the marble foyer, past the ancestral portraits, staring down like silent witnesses, and into the study. A grand room with leather walls, dark wood shelves, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the rear gardens. There, in his usual chair by the fire, sat Martin Whitaker, reading a leather-bound book and sipping a glass of neat scotch. "Graham," he said, surprised but composed, closing the book gently. "I didn't expect you today. Is something wrong?" "Yes," Graham said, voice low, eyes steady. "Something's wrong. Something's been wrong for a very long time." Martin tilted his head. "All right," he said, setting the glass aside. "Let's talk." Graham didn't sit. Instead, he reached into his coat, pulled out the photo, and handed it to him. "Do you know who this is?" His father took the photograph casually at first, until his eyes met the image, until recognition stole the blood from his face. He stared, a tremble in his hand, a flicker of something long buried rising to the surface like smoke through a crack in the foundation. "Catherine," or Martin whispered. "My God." Graham watched him closely. She was real. Wasn't she? "Yes," Martin said softly, sitting back down as if his legs could no longer carry the weight of the memory. "She was very real." "She was in love with you," Graham said. And you with her. Martin said nothing for a long time. He simply looked at the photograph, as though the paper itself could take him back. She was the first person who ever made me feel like I wasn't my father's son, like I didn't have to be ruthless or perfect. She believed in the good in people, in the good in me. Graham swallowed. Then why did you leave her? Martin closed his eyes for a moment. Because I was a coward, and because my father made sure I knew what would happen if I stayed with her. He threatened you? He threatened her, Martin said, his voice heavy. He said he'd cut me off, yes, but more than that. He said he'd destroy her, her reputation, her family's livelihood. He had connections, friends in the press, the kind who could ruin someone quietly, completely. He said he'd make sure she'd never get a job, never feel safe. He said he'd make sure she'd suffer for loving me. Graham felt a chill run through him. So you left. I thought I was protecting her, Martin whispered. I thought maybe if I made her hate me, she'd move on faster. So I told her it was over, that I'd changed my mind, that our world was too different, that I didn't want her anymore. But you did, Graham said quietly. I did, his father nodded, tears beginning to gather in his eyes. I never stopped. A long silence fell between them, broken only by the quiet ticking of the old grandfather clock by the window. She was pregnant, Graham said at last. Martin's head snapped up. What? You didn't know? Graham asked, already knowing the answer by the shock in his father's face. No, he breathed. She never told me. She had a daughter, Dad. Her name was Clara. And Clara had a daughter too. Her name is Lila. She's 5. Martin stood unsteady. I have a daughter? And a granddaughter? Graham nodded, feeling the tremor in his chest spread to his limbs. Yes, and they're not okay. Clara's sick, very sick, and Lila is just a little girl trying to keep her mom alive. She sold me this. He placed the music box on the table. Martin stared at it, his eyes wide. She came into an antique shop by herself, Graham continued. No coat thick enough for the cold, hands trembling. And she put this box on the counter and said she needed to sell it for her mother's medicine. Martin collapsed back into his chair as if the world had spun out from beneath him. I opened it when I got home, Graham said, heard the melody, found the hidden compartment, found this photo, and I came straight here. Martin was silent for a long time. Then, with shaking hands, he reached for the music box and opened it. The melody poured out, soft and mournful, the ballerina spinning slowly. She used to play this every night before bed, he whispered. She said it made her feel safe. Tears fell from his eyes and landed on the table beside the box. All these years, he choked. She must have thought I abandoned her, that I never cared. She told her daughter that the man who gave her this box never knew she existed, Graham said. She never said your name. I deserve that, Martin said. I deserve worse. But you have a chance, Graham said firmly, stepping forward. Right now, you have a chance to do something. Martin looked up. Let's find them, Graham continued. Let's help them, before it's too late. And to you, listening right now, if your heart is aching for Martin, for Graham, for Catherine, who loved and was left, for Clara, who never knew her father, and for little Lila, who carries a world far too heavy for such small shoulders, leave a comment below. Let them know you're here, that you believe people can change, that it's never too late to reach back for what was lost. Because this story is only beginning, and every encouraging word, every listener who stands beside them in spirit, gives them the strength to keep going. Because what comes next will change everything, and they can't do it without hope. They can't do it without you. The wind howled low that morning as Graham Whitaker stood beside his father outside a rundown building in the east side of the city. Not a part of town he'd ever walked through, let alone entered. This place, with its rusted mailboxes and peeling paint, was a world away from the manicured estates and glass towers they both knew. The snow from the night before still lingered in soft piles along the curb, and for a long moment neither man moved. Graham could feel his father's nervous energy beside him. The way Martin Whitaker, the titan of finance, was suddenly just a trembling man with too many years of silence and regret carved into the lines of his face. Are you sure it's this apartment? Martin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Apartment 3C, Graham nodded, glancing at the crumpled note in his hand. That's what she told the shopkeeper. And then he said nothing else. Because what could you say in a moment like this? What do you say to the father who once broke a woman's heart to protect her, not knowing he had also walked away from his child? What do you say to the man who was now about to face the consequences of a decision made decades ago? A decision that left a daughter without a father and a granddaughter without a history? They climbed the steps slowly, not from age or caution, but because every step seemed to echo like thunder in the hallway. On the third floor, a small paper butterfly was taped to one of the doors, fluttering gently in the draft. 3C, Graham said again. Martin raised his hand to knock and froze. What if she hates me? He asked, so quietly Graham almost didn't hear it. She has every right to, Graham said honestly, but I don't think she will. And then gently he knocked. There was a pause, no sound from inside. He knocked again. Still nothing. Graham leaned closer to the door and heard it. A soft cough, then footsteps. Small ones, fast ones. The door creaked open. A little girl with big, wondering eyes stood before them. Lila. Her hair was wild from sleep, and she was wearing mismatched socks. She looked up at Graham and smiled in recognition. You came back, she whispered. Yes, Graham said gently. Is your mom home? She nodded, then turned and called down the hall. Mom, the man from the shop is here. Another cough. Then a voice, faint and strained. Lila, who? Graham stepped inside, motioning for Martin to follow. The apartment was small, clean, but weary. The kind of space where everything had a story, and none of them were easy. On the wall were drawings. A photo of a woman smiling as she held a baby. A vase with one flower. It was quiet, too quiet for a home where a child lived. From the bedroom doorway, a woman appeared, thin, pale, and clinging to the doorframe for support. She looked no older than Graham, but there was something ancient in her eyes. Life had asked too much of her, and she had given it all. You? She breathed, recognizing Graham. Hi, he said softly. I bought the music box from Lila. She looked at her daughter, then at the man beside him, and her body tensed. Martin stepped forward slowly, hat in his hands like a schoolboy. Sarah, he said, his voice breaking. She stared at him. How do you know my name? He opened his mouth, then closed it. The words wouldn't come. So Graham stepped in. Sarah, he said, I believe that you're my sister. The room stilled. Not a sound. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. What? She said, her voice cracking. Graham stepped forward, his eyes gentle. Your mother, Catherine. She loved a man named Martin Whitaker. He didn't know she was pregnant when he left. That man is our father. She looked at Martin, searching his face, and she saw it. Not just resemblance, recognition, pain, truth. No, she whispered, stepping back. Please, Martin said, taking a shaky step toward her. I didn't know. I swear to you, Sarah. I never knew. She looked like she was about to collapse. Lila rushed to her side. Mom? The girl said, frightened. Graham moved quickly, helping guide Sarah to the couch. She sat down heavily, tears streaming silently from her eyes. My mother never told me his name, she said, staring at the floor. Only that he loved her, that he left, that he never came back. I didn't know, Martin repeated, dropping to his knees in front of her. If I had known, if I had even suspected, I would have looked. I would have come for you. I would have... He broke off, tears falling freely now. This man who had once been a fortress, now undone. Sarah looked at him, and in her eyes was not anger, but sorrow. All my life, she said slowly, I wondered who my father was. I imagined all kinds of stories, but I never thought he might actually care, that he might cry. I care, Martin said. I care more than you'll ever know. Lila watched from the edge of the room, her small body tense. Is he my grandpa? She asked timidly. Sarah turned, looked at her daughter, and then slowly nodded. I think so. The little girl looked at Martin with wide eyes. Do you want to be? Martin's lip trembled. He reached out a hand. More than anything, sweetheart. Lila stepped into his arms, and Martin held her like a man clinging to redemption. And dear listener, if your heart is aching right now, If you feel the sting of tears in your eyes the way I did writing this, leave a comment for Martin, for Sarah, for little Lila, for families torn apart by time and silence, but brought back together by grace and truth. Because sometimes fate is kind. And sometimes, even after decades of distance, love finds its way home. And this moment in that tiny living room with 3 generations and a second chance, this is just the beginning. The hospital hallway was quiet, almost reverent, as if the walls themselves understood the weight of the moment unfolding behind its doors. Sarah Moore lay in a narrow hospital bed, her skin pale as snow against the white sheets, a cannula in her nose and wires running from her arms like vines clinging to her. The soft beeping of monitors was the only rhythm in the room, steady but slow, like a clock running out of time. Graham Whitaker sat by her side, his hand wrapped gently around hers, while Martin, his father, their father, stood near the window, unmoving, watching the city stretch far beyond the glass like a world they had no control over. And there, near the foot of the bed, stood the doctor, calm, professional, but with eyes that betrayed the difficult news he was about to deliver. "She's stable for now," the doctor began softly, "but her liver function has declined sharply in the past week. The chemo helped for a while, but we've reached a critical point." Graham looked up sharply. "What does that mean?" "It means we're out of time," the doctor replied. "The only real chance she has now is a liver transplant." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. No one moved. Sarah closed her eyes slowly, as if letting that truth settle into her body. She had known, deep down. The nausea, the fatigue that never let up. The shadows under her daughter's eyes each time she had to explain that mommy just needs to rest. There was no more pretending. The doctor glanced at Martin, then at Graham. "We've already listed her in the National Transplant Registry, but the wait is long, too long. Even in critical cases like this, matching is complex and—" "I'll do it," Graham said suddenly, standing straighter. His voice didn't shake, it didn't question. "Test me. Right now." Sarah opened her eyes. "Graham, no." "I'm serious," he said, already moving toward the door. "Let's get tested. We don't have time to wait for a stranger." "You can't just—" "I can," he said, turning back to face her. "And I will." Martin stepped closer, his voice tense. "Graham." "I'm healthy," he said. "I'm young. I don't drink, I don't smoke, I've never had surgery. I'll pass, you know I will." Sarah tried to sit up, but a wave of exhaustion pulled her back. "No," she said weakly, "I can't let you do that." "Why not?" he asked. "Because I didn't grow up with you? Because we just met?" "Sarah, you are my sister. You didn't choose that, and neither did I, but here we are. And I am not going to sit back and let you fade away while I have the power to save you." Her lower lip trembled. "You don't owe me anything." "It's not about what I owe," Graham said, stepping to her side again, kneeling beside the bed. "It's about what I've finally found, Erden. For years I lived alone in a world full of noise. I had power, but I never had peace. I had success, but I never had connection. Then I met Lila. I saw her eyes. I saw the way she looked at you. And I knew. I knew that what mattered most in this world was right here." Sarah's tears were silent now. She reached out, cupping his cheek with her trembling hand. "I can't ask you to risk your life for mine." "You're not asking," he whispered. "I'm offering, and I won't take no for an answer." And to you, listening right now, if you feel that moment like a thunderclap in your chest, if you hear Graham's voice in your heart, choosing love over fear, choosing family over everything, then let him know. Leave a comment. Tell Graham you're with him. Because what he's doing isn't easy. It's terrifying, but it's real. It's love, the kind that steps forward even when the path is dark. Hours passed. The tests were done quickly, efficiently. Graham sat in a quiet exam room, blood drawn, scans taken, medical histories reviewed. Martin paced the hallway outside like a man with the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders. And Sarah? She lay in her room, her hand in Lila's, watching her daughter color a picture of the 4 of them. Her, Lila, Graham, and Martin, with the words "our new family" scribbled across the top. When the doctor returned, his face was unreadable. He glanced at Graham, then at Sarah. "You're a match," he said, "a very strong match." Relief flooded Graham's face. Martin exhaled deeply, almost collapsing into a chair. "But Sarah," Sarah began to cry because now it was real. Now Graham had a chance to give her life, and it terrified her. "I don't know if I can do this," she said, her voice breaking. "What if something goes wrong? What if something happens to you?" "Then we deal with it," he said simply. "Together." "I've only just found you," she whispered. "What if I lose you trying to keep myself alive?" "You won't," he said. "You won't. I've spent my entire life keeping everything at arm's length. This, this is the first thing that's felt right." She looked at him, and in that moment she saw not the businessman, not the billionaire, not the man from the shop, but her brother, her flesh and blood, a soul who had walked through his own loneliness, his own silence, and still chose to give something he could never get back. "If you believe in miracles," he said, "let me be one for you." The surgery was scheduled within 48 hours. Everything moved fast, too fast, and yet not fast enough. Lila clung to Sarah's hand the morning of the procedure, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Will you come back?" she asked, her voice small. "Yes, my love," Sarah whispered, kissing her forehead. "I'll come back. And when I do, we're going to have pancakes for dinner and watch 2 movies back to back." "And Uncle Graham?" Lila asked. Graham knelt beside her, already in his surgical gown. "I'll be there too, but only if you promise to draw me the coolest superhero cape you can think of." Lila giggled through her tears. "Pink and purple? The best colors?" And when the gurneys came to take them both, Martin stood frozen, helpless, watching his children be wheeled into surgery. He had built empires. He had survived the rise and fall of markets. But nothing had ever made him feel so afraid, or so alive. The surgery took 6 hours. Martin sat with Lila the entire time, holding her hand, reading her stories, trying not to show the fear pressing against his ribs. And when the surgeon finally came out, tired but smiling, Martin felt the world shift. "It went well," the doctor said. "Very well. Both are stable. The transplant was successful." Tears fell down Martin's face for the second time that week. And dear listener, if you've made it this far, if your heart has raced with them, broken with them, and hoped with them, comment below. Let Sarah know you're rooting for her recovery. Let Graham know his sacrifice wasn't just heroic, it was transformative. Because in this world, where we so often forget what matters, this family remembered. They remembered that love, real love, gives. Even when it's hard, even when it's scary, especially when it's all you have left. The morning of the surgery came slowly. The sky outside the hospital a soft, uncertain gray, as if the sun itself was hesitant to rise on what felt like the most important day of their lives. The air inside the ward was thick with quiet tension, and though nurses moved swiftly and efficiently, their voices were hushed, their glances solemn. In room 207, Sarah Moore sat propped up in bed, her body frail, her skin pale and papery under the hospital gown. But her eyes, those fierce, steady eyes, remained fixed on the clock as it ticked toward the hour when she and her brother would be wheeled away. In the next room, Graham Whitaker was preparing too, surrounded by doctors, prepped with IVs and monitors. But his mind was elsewhere, not on himself, not on the risks, not even on the weight of the operation. His thoughts were with Lila, his niece, Sarah's 5-year-old daughter, who, despite everyone's best efforts to shield her, had seen the fear in her mother's face and heard the word surgery whispered far too often. The plan had been simple. Martin, their father, would take Lila to the hospital cafeteria while the final preparations were underway. She'd have pancakes and warm cocoa. She'd draw pictures, maybe pick out a plush toy from the gift shop. She wouldn't have to see the IV lines. She wouldn't have to watch her mother disappear behind surgical doors. But plans rarely go smoothly when fear and love coexist, especially in the heart of a child who has already grown up far too fast. Martin returned 5 minutes later, panic written all over his face. "She's gone," he said breathlessly. "Lila." I turned away for just a minute. I went to the counter to get her chocolate milk, and when I came back, she wasn't there. The words hit like a hammer. "What do you mean, gone?" Sarah sat up despite the pain, her monitor beeping erratically. "She's missing?" "I've already called security," Martin said. "They're checking the cameras. She couldn't have gone far." But Graham didn't wait. He was already out the door, ripping off the surgical gown as he moved. His body buzzed with adrenaline, fear pushing aside everything else. He rushed down the corridor, past nurses and visitors, calling her name softly at first. Lila, Lila, it's Uncle Graham. Each room he passed, each corner turned without finding her. It pressed heavier and heavier on his chest. He knew that kind of fear. The fear that made you run, that made you hide, that told you if you just disappeared for a little while, maybe the bad thing wouldn't happen. He paused at the intersection of two long hallways, breath shallow, eyes darting, and then a flicker of something. A shadow near the hospital's small interfaith chapel, its door slightly ajar. He stepped closer. The room inside was dim, lit only by stained glass reflections and the flickering glow of prayer candles. And there, at the very back, curled beneath a wooden pew, was a small figure in a red coat and purple sneakers, her arms wrapped tightly around a stuffed bear. Lila. Graham knelt beside her quietly, not wanting to startle her. She didn't look up. I didn't want to go, she whispered into the bear's fur. If I'm not there, then it won't happen. Graham's heart cracked. He slowly sat beside her, letting his back rest against the pew, his voice gentle and low. You're scared. She nodded. You think if you hide, everything will be okay. Another nod. He looked around the chapel. You picked a good spot. It's quiet here. Safe. I used to hide in places like this too once I was little. I thought if I stayed very still, the world would stop moving. She turned toward him, her eyes glossy and red. You're going to die. No, he said, softly but firmly. I'm not. But the nurse said surgeries have risks. Mommy's already sick, and now you. I know, he whispered. It's a scary word, isn't it? Surgery. It sounds like something big and dark. But listen, I'm not going anywhere. I have too many people waiting for me to come back. And too many pancakes to eat with you and your mom. She sniffled. I'm going to be okay, he said again, more gently. I have to be. For you, for your mom, for all the things we still have to do together. She hesitated, then leaned into his arms, small and shaking, and he wrapped her up as tightly as the IV bandages would allow. I don't want to lose anyone else, she murmured. You're not going to, he promised. You're gaining someone. You didn't know I was your uncle before. Now you have one, and I plan to be around for a long, long time. And to you, listener, if your heart is sitting in your throat right now, if you're picturing that little girl trembling in the chapel, too scared to lose the people she just found, take a second. Leave a comment. Let Lila know she's not alone. Let Graham know that stepping into fear for love is a kind of bravery we should all remember. Because in that quiet chapel, something more than comfort was born. Family was born. 10 minutes later, Graham carried Lila back to Sarah's room in his arms. Martin rushed to them, relief flooding his face. And she's okay, Graham said. Just needed to feel safe. Sarah, still hooked to the monitors, tried to reach for her daughter. Lila ran to her mother's bedside, burying her face into her gown. I'm sorry I ran, Mommy. I didn't mean to scare you. You didn't scare me, Sarah whispered, kissing the top of her daughter's head. You just reminded me what I'm fighting for. Moments later, the surgical team returned, this time with understanding in their eyes. They waited while Lila held both her mother's and Graham's hands, whispering something only they could hear, a secret wish from a child's heart. And then gently they were wheeled away. The hall was silent again, but it wasn't hollow anymore. Because now, they weren't going into surgery as two people. They were going in as family. The first light of dawn spilled through the high hospital windows like a soft promise, tentative, golden, almost afraid to interrupt the stillness. Inside room 319, Sarah Moore lay quietly beneath warm blankets, her breathing steady at last, the worst behind her. She looked almost like she was sleeping, and for the first time in weeks, it wasn't the sleep of exhaustion or pain or surrender. It was the sleep of healing. Her face, once so ghostly pale, now carried a subtle flush of returning life, and her lips, dry and cracked for so long, curved ever so faintly upward at the corners, as though her dreams had begun to believe in second chances. Machines still beeped around her, tubes still tethered her body, but something intangible had shifted. Like the air after a long, bitter storm, it was quiet now, still, and full of something rare and precious. Graham Whitaker, her brother, and now her savior, was resting too, just down the hallway. His surgery had gone smoothly, the portion of his liver already regenerating, his body tired but intact. He hadn't asked for much, not a headline, not a speech, only one quiet moment to stand outside Sarah's room when he could, place a hand against the glass, and whisper, "We made it." It was enough. But the one who had changed the most, the one whose silence spoke loudest, was Martin Whitaker, the man who once built empires, crushed boardrooms, and had always seemed too tall, too proud, too unreachable. He had stood at the edge of this story in the beginning, a ghost from a life Sarah never knew she had. A man who had walked away from love because of fear and power, and then spent the next 30 years living with a silent ache no wealth could touch. And now, he sat at her bedside every morning. He brought her books and fresh flowers. He braided Lila's hair before school. He asked the nurses questions with trembling hands. He held Sarah's hand when she had nightmares. And he cried, not once, not privately, but often and openly, and without shame. On the third morning and after surgery, as the sun fully lifted into the sky, Sarah finally opened her eyes and met her father's gaze. Not with suspicion, this time, not with guarded grief, but with a quiet sort of curiosity, a gentle disbelief that he was still here. "Good morning," he said, voice trembling. "You came back," she whispered, weak but clear. "I told you I wouldn't leave," he answered. She studied him for a long time, the lines around his eyes, the silver at his temples, the way his hands, once used to signing billion-dollar contracts, now trembled slightly as he lifted her glass of water. "You look tired," she murmured. "I'm tired of missing the important things," he replied softly. She smiled just a little. He reached forward, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "You scared me," he admitted. "You scared me first," she replied, and they both laughed. Not the loud kind, but the fragile kind that carries the weight of history and the relief of survival. Later that afternoon, when Graham was strong enough to be wheeled into Sarah's room, Lila climbed up beside her mother and drew a picture. It was simple, 5 stick figures under a glowing sun. One was small with curly hair, one was holding flowers, one had a briefcase, one had a crown, one held a music box. At the top, in big letters, it said, "My whole family." Sarah looked at it for a long time, blinking back tears. "Did I draw it right?" Lila asked. Sarah pulled her daughter close. "You drew it perfect, sweetheart." Graham sat quietly nearby, the music box in his lap. He opened it, letting the melody fill the space. That gentle, familiar tune that once echoed through Sarah's childhood and now had brought her entire life full circle. Martin leaned against the windowsill, watching the scene unfold, his heart aching with gratitude and guilt and something else he hadn't dared to name before. Love. Real, messy, unconditional love. He didn't say it out loud, but in that moment, he made a promise to himself. No more absences, no more pretending, no more letting fear speak louder than love. And so when Sarah was discharged 3 weeks later, her steps slow but steady, her body weaker, but her spirit burning brighter than it had in years, she didn't go home to that tiny, drafty apartment where sickness had stolen so many memories. She went home to a house Martin had quietly bought for her, not a mansion, not a palace, but a warm, sun-drenched 2-story cottage nestled in a quiet neighborhood filled with trees and laughter and open skies. The front porch had a swing. The kitchen had light. The backyard had space for flowers and hopscotch and Sunday picnics. And the room they gave Lila overlooked the stars. "I don't deserve this," Sarah whispered when she saw it for the first time. "You deserve so much more," Martin said, pressing the key into her hand, "and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it." She looked at him, her heart full and aching all at once. "Thank you." "No," he said, "thank you for letting me in. And to you, yes, you listening right now, if this moment moves something in your heart, if you've ever longed to hear, 'Thank you for coming back,' or if you've ever whispered, 'You're still here' to someone who refused to give up on you, leave a comment for Sarah, for Graham, for Lila, for Martin. Let them know their healing matters, that their pain, their fight, and their faith in one another matters. Because some families are broken, but others, like this one, are broken open, so light can finally pour in. The sun was warm that afternoon, soft golden light spilling across the quiet park as if nature itself had planned something beautiful. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, and the laughter of children echoed across the grass, mingling with birdsong and distant ripples from the lake. It was the kind of spring day that felt like a beginning, as though all the pain of the months before had finally stepped aside to make room for something new, something whole. Under the sprawling branches of an old oak tree, a checkered blanket had been laid out. On it sat Sarah, still a little thin, still healing, but glowing with a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there for years. Her cheeks had color again. Her hair, growing back slowly, caught the sunlight. Every breath she took now came with less effort, less pain. She sat cross-legged beside her daughter, watching her with quiet reverence, the kind of gaze only a mother who's fought to stay alive truly knows how to give. Lila, now 6, was sprawled out on her stomach with a colored pencil in one hand and her instant camera in the other. She was taking photos of the trees, of her mother, of the sandwiches and the lemonade. Her backpack was stuffed with markers and a brand new family photo album, already half filled with captured moments that only months ago had seemed impossible. She hummed as she worked, carefree and full of life, her curl bouncing every time she moved. Across from them, Graham sat in the grass, his legs stretched out, sunglasses shading his eyes. He still bore a faint scar along his right side, a quiet reminder of the day he gave away part of himself to save the sister he never knew he had. But today, there was no weariness in his posture, just peace. Beside him was the now familiar old wooden box, the music box, its tiny ballerina hidden inside, waiting for her moment to dance once more. And standing just a few feet away was Martin, their father, the man who had once lost everything he truly loved, the man who had once walked away out of fear and finally returned with a heart willing to do the hard work of rebuilding. He stood watching them all, the 3 generations he now belonged to, as if unsure whether he was still dreaming. And then Graham stood. He cleared his throat, brushing off grass from his jeans, and walked toward Lila, carrying the music box like it was treasure. "Hey," he said with a small smile, kneeling beside her. "Oh, I've been holding on to something for you." Lila sat up, her eyes widening when she saw what he held. "The music box," she whispered. He nodded. "The same one you sold. Remember?" She looked up at her mother, then at her uncle. "But I gave it away." "No," Graham said gently. "You didn't give it away. You gave it back to where it belonged. You gave us a beginning, Lila. That little music box brought us together. It found your uncle. It led me to your mom. It brought your grandfather back into our lives. You were the one who started it all." He opened the lid, and once again, that delicate melody began to play. The little ballerina twirled gently, her dance timeless and full of memory. The notes drifted through the air like soft whispers from the past, and all of them paused to listen. Sarah closed her eyes. Martin bowed his head. Lila smiled, not a child's grin, but something deeper. She understood now. She might have only been 5 years old when she stepped into that antique shop, but the moment had planted the seed for everything good that followed. Her courage, her love for her mother, her belief that even strangers could help, it had rewritten their destiny. Graham set the music box down on the blanket and pulled something from his pocket, a small wrapped package. "What's this?" Lila asked. "Open it." She tore away the paper to reveal a brand new instant camera, pink with glitter along the edges. "I figured," Graham said, "it's time we start recording more than memories. Today's special." Lila beamed, loading the film with practiced ease. "All right," she said, holding up the camera. "Everyone sit together." Sarah laughed as she scooted closer to Graham, who wrapped an arm around her shoulder. Martin moved in beside them, still a little awkward, but when Lila threw her arms around his neck and said, "You have to smile, Grandpa," something inside him softened all at once. The music box still played. The breeze still carried the scent of wildflowers. And the shutter clicked. A flash. A moment. Captured forever. A little girl, her mother, her uncle, and her grandfather, all smiling under the soft spring sun. Later that evening, after the picnic had ended and the sun had begun its descent behind the trees, and Lila sat between Sarah and Graham, flipping through the fresh photographs in her hands. "This one's my favorite," she said, holding it up. The 4 of them, arms wrapped around each other, the music box in the foreground, the oak tree behind. We look happy. We are happy, Sarah said, resting her head on her daughter's. You think Grandma would have liked this day? Lila asked, her voice thoughtful. Martin answered quietly, his eyes far away. She would have loved it. She always believed music was the sound of the heart remembering something important. Lila leaned over and gently closed the music box. We remembered, she said, and for a moment no one spoke. There was no need. The moment said everything. Dear listener, if you've walked this entire journey with us, from the music box being sold in desperation to the surgery that brought them to the edge, to this day beneath the spring sky, then your heart knows the truth. This wasn't just a story about a little girl and a melody. It was a story about healing, about rebuilding, about what it means to finally come home. So if you felt something while listening, if your chest ached when Sarah risked everything, if your heart swelled when Graham gave of himself, if your eyes filled when Martin finally held his granddaughter, leave a comment below. Let Sarah know you're cheering her on. Let Graham know that his sacrifice mattered. Let Martin know that redemption is still possible, even after years of silence. And let little Lila know that the bravery of a child can change the course of many lives. Because in the end, the music box wasn't magic. It was memory. It was love. It was the sound of family finding each other again. And what can we learn from this? Maybe this, that life is too short to withhold love, that the people we lose or lose touch with might still be waiting for a second chance, that wounds, no matter how deep, can heal if we meet them with honesty, courage, and time. And maybe most importantly, that sometimes the smallest act of kindness, selling a box, making a phone call, showing up unannounced, can become the turning point in someone's story. You never know what you hold in your hands until you open it and find a melody that ties past and future together. So hold on to your people. Say the things you've been waiting to say. Let go of the silence and follow the music. Because one day, when you least expect it, you might find yourself exactly where you're meant to be, with the people who are meant to be yours all along. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to support these characters by leaving a like, commenting with your favorite moment, and subscribing to this channel so you don't miss the next powerful story. Every time you share a kind word, it becomes part of the love this family never gave up on. Until next time, stay tender, stay brave, and always, always listen for the music, because you never know where it might lead.